This futuristic urban river canyon reflects a staggering amount of resources, capital, and innovation. It's also America's railroad hub, and the central node in its extensive system of navigable fresh waterways. Its roads lead to most corners of the continent, and its runways send direct flights to over 200 destinations. All of this supports one of the planet's most productive regions for growing crops and extracting raw materials. The opportunities available in and around this Prarie Boomtown have attracted hungry young workers for nearly 2 centuries. In fact, so many arrived daily that it sustained the highest population growth rate on Earth for several consecutive decades in the late 1800s. But instead of allowing haphazard expansion, planners took advantage of the area's remarkable flatness and laid out the most orderly grid ever imagined. Now, more straight streets and uniform blocks exist here than anywhere else. This is the making of modern Chicago, the Crossroads of America. The crown jewel of the post-industrial United States has a metropolitan population of 9.5 million, and an economy considered by some experts to be the most balanced and resilient on Earth. Its story began when a Haitian-born fur trader and his wife, a member of the local indigenous Potawatomi tribe, established an outpost here in 1779. It remained a sleepy frontier village for decades until Chicago's first locomotive, the Pioneer, made its inaugural trip out to nearby Des Plaines in 1848. I learned about this pivotal moment firsthand when I visited the Chicago History Museum for a trip back in time with Paul DeRica.
So from those very humble beginnings, in 1848, the railroad industry really takes off. And Chicago is ideally suited to become a kind of center of this growing industry. So all the kind of raw materials that they're producing, right? All the agricultural materials, the livestock, the lumber, the ore, all of it can come via the railroad into Chicago. And then within the city, all of those goods can be processed. Lots of different things can be manufactured, and they can be then kind of sent out to the growing western states, but also to the well-developed eastern states at that time.
These products were listed in mail order catalogs, an industry invented and based in Chicago. The conveniences of online shopping can be traced directly back to Montgomery Ward and Sears, businesses that were only possible because the railroad reliably delivered.
By the beginning of the 20th century, Chicago had close to 40 different railroad lines running through it. Most cities today will have like maybe one Union Station or a central terminal, but by the early 1900s, Chicago had 6 different ones.
Chicago was also responsible for the rapid growth of the vast prairies that stretched westward to the Rocky Mountains. A Chicagoan had invented the mechanical reaper, freeing wheat farmers from the back-breaking, inefficient work of harvesting their crops by hand. And when they shipped their wheat back into the city, 12 massive grain elevators stored it before it was sent across the lake to Buffalo, or downriver and onto ocean liners waiting in New Orleans. Within a handful of years, Chicago had displaced ports in Russia to become the world's largest mover of grain. But even with this bounty, prairie farmers couldn't build much of anything because their lands had few trees to harvest. Good thing there were expansive forests in Wisconsin and Michigan north of Chicago, and soon it became the world's largest lumber market.
The scene on the south branch of the Chicago River, you cannot witness anymore. It does not exist in Chicago. It doesn't exist, actually, I think, anywhere in the world. Stack after stack after stack of lumber, all waiting to be shipped on downstate in Illinois, out to Iowa, on to Nebraska or Kansas.
There are cases where entire prairie families are standing out there in this windswept prairie bog, waiting for their town to arrive. Bar, chapel, houses, it's already made in Chicago. It's stamped on it, made in Chicago, along with the reapers and everything else. Here comes the town.
Almost overnight, Chicago had transformed this expansive grassland into the world's breadbasket. But these farmers also produced protein.
By the early 1860s, you have this immense railroad network that makes it very easy for livestock to come into the city, be processed, and then kind of sent out to other parts of the country. And so a group of meat packers get together and they decide that they need basically a kind of central district where they can kind of rationalize the processing of livestock. And so on Christmas Day, 1865, the Union Stockyard opens. This immense area to the south of the city's business district, employing tens of thousands of people.
The smells and conditions these workers were exposed to were incredible. Up to 75,000 pigs waiting for slaughter could be penned at the same time.
In about 15 minutes, the hog goes through this process of passing about 125 or 150 people, depending on the packing house.
This was new. This was the modern. This was the Industrial Revolution at its most dramatic, its starkest.
Hundreds of millions of calories were now passing through the processing plants and storage facilities of Chicago every single day, beating the ravenous Union Army in its hard-fought victory in the Civil War. But there was a cost to all this activity.
Chicago is situated magnificently for trade, but it's a pestilential swamp. It's a horrible place for a city. It's an absolute hellhole.
Children were playing with maggots as if they were little pets.
Before long, cholera had crept up the Mississippi to kill 60 Chicagoans a day during the warm summer months.
It's a devastating disease, and it's very difficult to watch someone with cholera because they become violently ill and often die within hours.
The culprit was the putrid waste all the residences and industries dumped, only some of which made its way into the rivers and canals. To find a solution, Chicago brought in Ellis Chesbrough, one of America's brightest sanitation engineers. He designed gravity-fed sewers to flush the waste into the river, and then deep into the river by dredging it, and using the fill to raise Chicago's ground level 10 feet. Lifting all the existing buildings safely required widespread adoption of a new system, George Pullman's jack.
The Pullman method was to put the foundation of the building on jacks that could be turned. You might have 1,000 jacks around the base of a big building, and 250 men blow a whistle, and little by little they would jack up the building, and other people would be putting bricks in around to shore up the foundation.
The new sewers worked as planned, but the sewage still ended up contaminating the city's source of drinking water, the lake.
One of the McCormicks writes to the old man, "Pop," he said, "I was up at Clark Street Bridge and I'm looking and the river's scarlet." Can you imagine that? There's heads of pigs in the river and things like that. And this is what's flowing out into the lake.
Officials ordered tunnels dug to water intake houses called cribs, built miles into the lake to get beyond the stagnant pollution and send clean water back to the city. This worked until it didn't. Whenever there was a big storm, so much dirty city runoff washed into the lake that it threatened to reach the intake cribs, which would render them useless.
At a certain point in time, it just proved untenable to just keep on building longer and longer pipes to try to get cleaner water that's farther out in the lake.
Desperate to solve this problem for good, Chicago again turned to Chesbrough, who drew up a truly audacious mega-project. His solution? Permanently reversed the direction of the river so that it flowed west toward the Mississippi instead of east into the lake. It was a feat never before attempted in human history, a manipulation of the natural world so fantastic that many Chicagoans simply thought it couldn't be done.
So how could you reverse the flow? Well, you must realize that the landform drops off. When you get down to the city of Joliet, you're 40 feet below Lake Michigan.
The idea was to link up the South Branch of the Chicago River with the Des Plaines River and to break through that subcontinental divide. If you could dig deep enough, gravity would then pull it all away from the city.
Thousands of laborers spent years digging across the state of Illinois. trying to cut a massive 28-mile canal through rocky soil. When they had finally finished and were ready to let the water in, they still weren't positive it would even work. But after a few tense moments, amazingly, the water began to flow slowly downhill. Chesborough and those who saw the project through to completion after his death were heroes.
That's the beauty of Chesborough to the city fathers. He comes in, technology will solve it. He's fed it at banquets because he allows Chicago to grow without changing anybody's behavior, without controlling any of the economic interests who are dumping in the river. And they can continue to use that river as a sewer and send that garbage downriver toward less powerful and complaining canal towns.
Not only did the canal eliminate Chicago's sanitation and drinking water crisis, but its sheer size and depth suddenly unlocked the cheapest mode of transport, river floating barge. At the dawn of the 20th century, the canal, combined with the railroads and all the industry based in the city, had cemented Chicago's place as the Crossroads of America. Heading into the last quarter of the 1800s, no city on Earth was better positioned for commercial dominance than this one. The capital of the Midwest had just fueled the Union's victory in the Civil War, and its high concentration of industries situated along its many rail lines, vast lakefront, and re-engineered river was attracting thousands of new arrivals every month. But in their rush to expand as quickly as possible, its builders had inadvertently made conditions just right for disaster. Chicago was the world's largest market for lumber. Not only did it supply its rapidly increasing population with boards and planks for their homes, but it also stored huge quantities of wood awaiting shipment to towns popping up all over the western prairies.
The city is built without any concern for nature, without any concern for the realities of the prairie. Prairies burn. It's built because it's built for money. Do it quickly, make a buck, move on.
And of course, the city is built so much out of wood.
The streets are wood. The bridges are wood. It's so hot that the tar on some of the roofs starts to blister in the sun.
After an extremely dry summer, on an October night in 1871, a strong wind blew into Chicago from the west. Mystery still surrounds exactly what happened next, but somehow a fire started in a barn and quickly spread to other structures. A few minutes later, a huge explosion rocked the north side of the river after a spark landed in a railroad car filled with kerosene. The extreme heat generated by tens of thousands of tons of highly flammable materials all over the city, combined with the whipping wind, created its own weather system.
The scariest thing about the fire was the wind that the fire created. Convection whirls, they were called. They spin and spin and spin, creating a tornado effect. And then these tornadoes would come and they'd hit a building, and they'd take the roof off a building and deposit it a quarter of a mile away.
The wooden city went up like a tinderbox. To escape certain death, thousands of terrified residents waded into the lake and stayed there all night. When the sun finally rose, illuminating a black, smoke-filled sky, the scope of the devastation was clear. Over 17,000 buildings and 73 miles of streets were suddenly gone. Incredibly, only about 300 people perished, but over 100,000 were instantly homeless, a third of the city's population. It was one of the worst fire disasters in modern history. But some nearby areas fared even worse. The same windstorm fueled major fires all around the Great Lakes, most tragically in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a town engulfed so suddenly that 2,500 people died and 1.5 million acres of surrounding forest burned. Cut off from the rest of the world when its telegraph lines were charred and eclipsed by the magnitude of property loss in Chicago, the little-known Peshtigo fire is still the deadliest blaze in American history.
Fire provides a mythology. Chicago's going to rise out of the ashes, does arise out of the ashes. How much of the city is actually burned? Well, only a small part of the actual city is burned, but that's not the way we think about the fire.
You couldn't take away Chicago's geography. It was still the gateway to the American West. Its railroads weren't destroyed. It still had these lines of track that were going to deliver its commodities to the rest of the country and the rest of the world.
What many people don't realize is that it left the west side and the south side largely unscathed. And that was really important when it came to Chicago's ability to quickly rebuild. Because what you had on the west and south side were not only 2/3 of the city's population living there, but you had the bulk of the city's industries. A lot of the lumber yards, that's where you had the steel mills, supplies that could still come into the city because the railroad network was also still largely in place after the fire.
Many of the city's most prominent residents wasted no time trying to jumpstart the rebuilding process. However, bankers in New York were wary of losing their investments in another fire. To assuage their concerns, Chicago quickly adopted new building codes that mandated the use of less flammable materials like brick and terracotta, setting the stage for the largest construction boom in American history and a new architectural era. Hemmed in by water on 3 sides and railroad yards to the south, there was nowhere in the city's central Loop district to build but up. 2 innovations made the skyscraper possible: elevators and structural steel. In 1885, the first steel-framed high-rise building in the world rose in Chicago.
Instead of having a structure where all the weight is in the walls and it's kind of holding the structure together, in Chicago, architects began experimenting with using a steel skeleton or an iron skeleton or a frame that you can more or less then hang the exterior of the building on. And that allows you to create much more dynamic, lighter, and more flexible structures that can go significantly higher. You also get a lot more ornamentation. The exterior becomes less functional and more artifice. There's also, though, innovations in glass manufacturing, and Chicago architects are some of the first architects to kind of experiment with using increasingly larger plates of glass, which allows more natural light to come in.
The start of the skyscraper age has transformed not only this city, but our entire planet. Today, Chicago still ranks among the tallest and densest skylines in the world. But the inception of this period of development was a spectacle of organized chaos.
The soot coming off the street, this cloud of smoke hanging over the city, the rush of people, this cavalry charge on the streets, streetcar lines all over the place, trolleys going along, the skyscrapers going up, a story every 3 days. People are watching them like urban shows. The sound of rivet guns, which are just invented at the time, bang, bang, bang of the rivet systems. It just seemed like one vast construction site.
Amidst this swirl of activity in 1893, Chicago hosted the Columbian Exposition, also known as the World's Fair. Built on over 600 acres of former marshland at the present location of Jackson Park, the fairgrounds drew 27.5 million visitors over 6 months, at a time when the population of the entire country was just over 60 million. Its exhibits projected American optimism, boosted Chicago's image as the country's industrial capital, and had a profound cultural influence, especially in architecture and the arts. Just 20 years after the fire, Chicago had rebuilt to make its debut on the biggest stage.
The thing that's remarkable is how kind of quickly it came into being. The sort of concerted effort that had to go into its design and construction, and then also its organization as well. You had iron or steel substructures, and then you had draped over it these exteriors that were made of a material called staff, which is basically a kind of plaster that can easily be shaped and molded and manipulated. And that's how you created something that looked more or less like marble with all of these ornamentations, but it wasn't a particularly permanent material.
Despite relying on a little illusion, Chicago's ability to pull off an event of this scale was miraculous. Eric Larson documented the feverish preparations to get ready for opening day in his brilliant book, The Devil in the White City, which tells the true story of the prominent architect in charge of realizing the fair's grand vision. To build the fair, Daniel Burnham had confronted a legion of obstacles, any one of which should have killed it long before opening day. Together, he and his architects had conjured a dream city whose grandeur and beauty exceeded anything each singly could have imagined. Visitors wore their best clothes and most somber expressions, as if entering a great cathedral. Some wept at its beauty. Whole villages had been imported from Egypt, Algeria, Dahomey, and other far-flung locales, along with their inhabitants. The Street in Cairo exhibit alone employed nearly 200 Egyptians. Everything about the fair was exotic and, above all, immense. A single exhibit hall had enough interior volume to have housed the U.S. Capitol, the Great Pyramid, Winchester Cathedral, Madison Square Garden, and St. Paul's Cathedral, all at the same time. It's difficult to overstate how influential this period was for Chicago's rise to dominance as an urban center, just as the rest of the country was emerging as a global power.
At the time of the fire in the early 1870s, the city had a population of about 300,000. But by the time of the 1893 World's Fair, Chicago had grown to a city of over 1 million residents. It had surpassed Philadelphia as the second largest city in the country. At that point in time, no city in the history of the world had gotten big so quickly as Chicago. It had actually become the 4th largest city by population in the entire world. By the end of the 1890s, you had London, New York, Paris, Chicago. Those were the 4 largest global cities.
True to its innovative spirit, the Chicago area is home to several cutting-edge industries. Like the emerging field of quantum technology, Fermilab is America's premier particle physics research facility located in the city's western suburbs. Less than 10 miles away is Argonne National Laboratory, connected by a fiber optic cable to the University of Chicago. Scientists there are trying to apply atomic principles to improve communications and computing.
People are realizing you can use the quantum properties of nature to build a new paradigm for information processing. This can outperform classical computing by orders of magnitude.
4 of the 10 quantum labs in the United States are located in Illinois, which receives roughly 4 of every $10 the federal government invests in the technology. Illinois also produces far more nuclear power than anywhere else in America. 75% of Chicago's electricity needs are now met by the state's 11 reactors, which are cooled by the ample fresh water from its vast lake and numerous rivers. Chicago is where the dawn of the nuclear age happened, as America's Manhattan Project raced the Germans during World War II.
The role of the University of Chicago was to produce a self-sustaining chain reaction in a nuclear reactor.
It did just that on December 2nd, 1942, when Enrico Fermi's team achieved the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction in a facility hidden underground on campus. Today, a different source of clean energy is proliferating on the edges of Chicago: wind. During my drive south, I encountered enormous turbines towering over cornfields that stretched as far as the eye could see in every direction for miles along the highway. With so many major industries present in the Chicago area, its economy is now one of the world's most diversified. It's also one of the planet's most racially diverse cities, with a population roughly equal parts white, black, and Latino. Many other ethnic communities number in the thousands too. But it wasn't always this colorful. Waves of European immigrants during the 1800s made the city's population 98.1% white in 1900. But over the next 70 years, in a period known as the Great Migration, 6 million African Americans left the South to settle in Chicago and other cities in the North.
My family, we moved to Chicago in August of 1919. They came for 3 principal reasons: to be able to fight back if they were attacked, vote, and to have a better education for their children.
By the 1990s, Chicago's South Side and its adjoining suburbs had become the largest African American majority region in the country, fostering all sorts of talent, from academics, activists, and rappers to global icons like Michael Jordan, arguably the most successful American pro athlete, Oprah Winfrey, the richest African American of the 20th century, and the Obamas. Interestingly, none of them live in Chicago full-time anymore. Maybe that's because none except the First Lady are originally from the city, and perhaps never grew to love its frigid winters. My friend Mark, who moved here a few years ago, put Chicago's notorious weather in perspective.
That's the thing about Chicago. Winters are brutal. People hibernate. And it's really hard because they're in your house, in your cocoon. But the spring and the summer, I think it's just one of the best places in the country at that time of year for like energy, vibe, activity. If you love being in a city that has water and beaches and festivals and food, there's nowhere else you want to be in America in summer. It's just awesome.
To continue bringing in visitors and goods, Chicago has been upgrading its rail network. 1 in every 4 freight trains in the country now rolls through the area. A decade ago, this created congestion and delays that rippled across the nation's rail yards. To smooth things out, a series of 70 rail improvement projects are in various stages of completion, with more than 24 already finished. Chicago's leaders also just secured funding to tackle their next big priority, renovating Union Station, the beating heart of America's rail network. Mostly underground, it covers more than 9 city blocks.
Chicago's Union Station is on track to receive more than $93 million worth of upgrades and improvements. In the last 15 years, the number of trains on Illinois tracks has doubled.
But it's Chicago's famous light rail system that is one of its most quintessential features. To build it in the late 1800s, the L's engineers relied on the region's massive ore mines and steel mills that had just made the skyscraper possible to elevate its tracks over streets and between existing buildings. This spared Chicagoans the headache and expense of digging more tunnels, although it created a permanent headache of a different sort for its unfortunate neighbors.
How often does the train go by?
So often you won't even notice it. So is this where you come to relax for peace and quiet?
Yeah, this is it.
With 8 lines, the amount of metal required to build the L turbocharged Chicago's steelmaking industry, which nimbly shifted to producing bombs, jeeps, tanks, and planes during World War II. Chicago's steel industry was vital to the Allied effort, producing more tons of the super-strong metal than the entire United Kingdom every year from 1939 to 1945, and all of Nazi Germany from 1943 to 1945. Most of the industrial facilities that fueled Chicago's original growth are long gone. The city has transformed itself into the transportation, distribution, and logistics leader of the world's largest consumer economy. Vast warehouses are clustered all along the canal and river, around its many large rail yards, and to the west of O'Hare, the world's second busiest airport in terms of aircraft movements per day. One such strip of warehouses leads directly to the Merchandise Mart, which was the largest building ever constructed when it opened, capping a century of commercial progress.
Merchants from around the nation could buy goods in bulk and then sell them to their individual customers. In fact, my own grandfather was a purchaser for a university in Cleveland, and he would go to the mart and look at furniture for the classrooms. Merchandise Mart is like an IKEA showroom.
Chicago's location seems ideal for urban development, but its planners understand that its geography is far from perfect. Since its founding, the city has waged a never-ending battle with nature to keep its source of drinking water, the lake, separate from the river, which carries its treated sewage. Built on top of a drained swamp, whenever there's a big rainstorm, parts of the city flood when its sewers and river overflow. Chicago's latest answer to this puzzle has been to create more and more places to hold water during storms. Since the 1970s, it has been adding massive tunnels, cavernous holding chambers, and gigantic lagoons like this one, a repurposed old mine. When this latest round of extreme engineering is complete at the end of the decade, the system will have the capacity to store 20 billion gallons, which it can then treat and slowly release into the river. The city is also creating more open spaces, green roofs, and porous parking lots for rain to drain into the ground. These investments have been so successful that cities around the world are building similar infrastructure of their own. Yet even a water holding system of this scale has its limits. During the most severe storms, when Chicago's reservoirs and tunnels fill up, managers have no choice but to divert untreated wastewater directly into the river. This causes its level to rise quickly, but before it overflows its banks, there's one more place they can release it: out into Lake Michigan. Once the river rises above the lake level, the lockmaster can open the gates that usually hold the lake back to temporarily release excess river water into the lake instead and avoid flooding the city. This has always been an option of last resort. Then came the rains of 2020. Record precipitation fell over a 24-hour period, filling the water storage infrastructure. Just 3 days later, another big storm hit. But this time there was nowhere for the surging river water to go because the lake had also risen to a record high, which meant the lockmaster had to wait much longer than usual for the river to pass the lake level so he could open the gates and drain the river into the lake. The delay caused Lower Wacker Drive to flood, and key buildings like Willis Tower to lose power. Thousands of homes, mostly on the south side, took on water in their lower levels. The lake's extreme height means that when storms hit, buildings normally protected by beaches and boulders are battered by waves that threaten their foundations.
They hit our seawall, which is very solid. All of a sudden you feel the building rock a little bit.
One driving factor swelling the lake is the region's air temperature, which has increased 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit. This is part of the tug of war between precipitation and evaporation, according to hydrologist Drew Grunewald.
Precipitation over the past year, as well as the past decade, has been well above average. So we're getting a lot more water coming into the Great Lakes Basin. But another interesting thing that happened, and this started in about 2014, is that evaporation rates slowed down, and they slowed down drastically. So essentially you have more water coming in, less water leaving. That leads to a net increase in water levels across the entire region.
What makes this all the more unprecedented is that in 2013, just 7 years before the high water event, Lake Michigan had fallen to its lowest level since record-keeping began more than 150 years ago. Typically, the lake level fluctuates a few inches up or down from year to year, so an upward swing of more than 6 feet in just 7 years is unheard of. With climate extremes now the day-to-day reality, leaders should plan for scenarios on each end of the spectrum. But with such a storied history of innovation, Chicago is definitely up for the challenge. Next, we'll take to the air for a tour to learn exactly why Chicago's motto is City in a Garden. Chicago has incredible public spaces that elevate its residents' lives. The most popular park in the city is Millennium Park, which opened in 2004. It features the seamless, liquid mercury-inspired cloud gate sculpture that locals affectionately call the Bean, the 11,000-capacity Pritzker Pavilion and Great Lawn, and a hybrid video fountain sculpture. The brainchild of Chicago's longest-serving mayor, Richard M. Daley, sits atop parking garages and a major commuter rail terminal, making it the world's largest rooftop garden.
The initial planning process was for a series of
defined outdoor spaces, room-like outdoor spaces. So you had a lot of money, a ruler, Mayor Daley, who had enormous power, and the patrons went after the best in the world. Frank Gehry, a leading architect, and Nish Kapoor, great Indian-born British sculptor, Jaume Plensa from Spain. I mean, this was not just going to be any park, it was going to be something great.
Surrounding downtown is Chicago's system of boulevards, the first comprehensive greenway in a major U.S. city. Linking numerous parks, these wide, grass and tree-lined streets were designed for leisurely strolls, cycles, or drives, and they help explain Chicago's motto, City in a Garden. And then there's the one feature that truly sets Chicago apart. Nearly every inch of its 30-mile lakefront is a park. When I was in town, I biked about a third of its length from the Navy Pier south to Jackson Park, the site of the World's Fair in 1893. That's when my camera caught the attention of another cyclist who was also inspired by the fair. Only she had come from a little further.
My name is Julia. I just arrived in Chicago, actually. Well, what happened is 2 years ago, I was reading a book about the first Italian bike touring pioneer, and he went to Chicago from Milan because of the fair in 1893. And I'm cycling the same way he did a long time ago, 130 years ago. That's why I'm here. So there you go.
And you literally just pulled in. Behind Julia, you can see how far away downtown is, and the city limit extends for miles further north of it and miles further to the south of where we were standing on Promontory Point. Right nearby is the site of the nearly complete Obama Presidential Center, which is rising in the south side neighborhood of Hyde Park, right next to the Museum of Science and Industry, the largest of its kind in the Western Hemisphere, and one of the only buildings remaining from the 1893 fair. The Obama's Presidential Library, like their home for 8 years in D.C., is adjacent to a long public lawn, the Midway Plaisance, which connects Jackson Park with Washington Park to the west, forming one of the largest continuous urban public spaces in the country. In fact, Washington Park's large open green was where the Olympic Stadium would have been if the city had succeeded in its bid for the 2016 Summer Games. The Midway also runs through the University of Chicago, one of the best colleges in the world. But one of the most ideal vantage points for viewing Chicago's public lands is from the top of 875 North Michigan Avenue, formerly known as the John Hancock Center. Nothing beats viewing the world in 360 degrees from 1,000 feet up, even if the air was thick with smoke from wildfires in Canada. As I moved from window to window, it was clear to me that an incredible amount of forethought had gone into the construction of the continuous series of parks, beaches, and trails along the shoreline. Yet just a few years ago, this vision remained unfulfilled. Turns out, it took a bizarre showdown to remove the last major hurdle blocking uninterrupted access to Lake Michigan. For years, the city had been trying to close a small airport called Meigs Field on Northerly Island, which after 9/11 it also viewed as a clear security threat. Yet these efforts were repeatedly blocked by the FAA. So in the middle of the night in 2003, Mayor Daley took matters into his own hands.
It was quite a sight. Bulldozers, backhoes, and other heavy equipment rolling through the loop just before midnight under police escort. Their destination was Meigs Field.
There was no warning, no nothing. Guys go out the next morning to go flying and the runway's plowed.
Daley destroyed the runways at midnight to do an end run around lawsuits and court delays.
As mayor of the city of Chicago, public safety is one of my primary responsibilities. I take it very seriously. I am not willing to wait for a tragedy, as some have asked me to do, to happen before making a very difficult and tough decision.
Daley's 22 years in office easily make him the Chicagoan whose impact is most felt in the city today. And this incident sums up his bold, some would say brash, action-oriented leadership style. Today, the island has been restored to its initial purpose, a park. The Meigs saga is a reminder that these public spaces are the product of deliberate action, considerable funds, and sustained effort.
They didn't just happen. They weren't just naturally occurring places like, oh, here's a green space, here's a lagoon. It's like, no, in most cases, that lagoon didn't exist. They had to dig it out. Or like with the lakefront, but the land didn't even exist. They made the land. They filled in the lake to make the land to build the park.
Chicago Parks historian Julia Bachrach wrote the book on the subject.
There was a movement in Chicago where people felt that for the city to become a great city, it needed a system of parks. And the head recreation director at that time, named V.K. Brown, was a really democratic thinker. And so he was trying to come up with ways to have different groups of people spend time together.
Recreation is a basic human need in our civilization, like education or public health or sanitation. It's the responsibility of the municipal government itself, the people's responsibility.
Jane Addams also felt a responsibility to make people's lives better. Her famous settlement house started as an effort to help poor immigrants in her Chicago neighborhood, but grew into one of the most powerful social reform movements in history. Addams became the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and she inspired another first, Chicago's field houses. These park buildings, of which there are now over 200, are for the community to gather or exercise, no matter what the weather's like outside.
With these great buildings, there could be all kinds of activities. People had the opportunity to come and actually use a shower bath. They didn't have running water at home.
Another amenity located in the surrounding counties is the forest preserves, an unrivaled network of prairies, woods, and wetlands.
People in the city don't really know about the forest preserves. They're kind of a wonderful green emerald ring around the city. The forest preserves are owned by the taxpayers, and it's about 69,000 acres, 11% of our land. It's a wonderful, wonderful asset.
We're the last bastion in many cases for certain plants and animals that really are only found here in the forest preserves of Cook County.
It's now the largest urban preserve in the United States.
To have this kind of open space so close to a major metropolis is really unheard of. The more people are connected and have an appreciation for it, the more people will want to protect it and even enhance it and even grow it.
That's definitely been the city's approach to the river, transforming it over the last century from a reeking public sewer to one of Chicago's most celebrated public spaces. The Riverwalk, completed in 2016, allows people to take in the incredible architecture towering above from water level. The path also passes under several bridges, whose foundations divide the promenade into a series of rooms. Walking along it in the evening now has an amazing vibe, and is a major part of why downtown has become the fastest growing neighborhood in Chicago or any other city in the country. But it's just one of many features that has the capital of the Midwest poised to continue inspiring the world for decades to come.